Thank you, and good evening to everybody for joining us tonight. Firstly, thank you to NPA members and pharmacy colleagues for joining us in what I know will be an illuminating and useful bit of dialogue. This is another episode in this week's series of sessions that the NPA are running as a virtual conference, and I hope you've taken the opportunity to see a couple of them already, especially the one with Matt Hancock and our dear CEO Mark Lionette on Monday. Really good bit of work. So the title for tonight's session is The Wright Review. Does the Wright Review deliver for independent pharmacy today and prepare us for a better tomorrow? Big subject. So before we start, please can I share with you a few bits of tonight's mechanics. So here we are again on Zoom, our favorite new way of communicating. Folks, compliments to you, because we've had so many registrants. Actually tonight we've had to disable chat because we think it would have just spun out of control. But we do want the ability to interact with you so that you can share with us your thoughts and reactions. So you'll notice that you've got access to the question functionality. And genuinely, we want you to put some really good, juicy, challenging questions in there. But if you're people who like to connect and stick stuff up there anyway, don't worry, type like Billy-O, because anything you share with us we'll review afterwards. But if you could highlight if you have a specific question on the chat, on the question function, that would be brilliant. Thank you. So let's get started then. I'm really delighted that I've got a bunch of friends and colleagues with me tonight for this session, and I'm just going to introduce you to them one by one. And then what we'll do is we'll let them have an individual bit of time to share with you their thoughts about the Wright Review. And then about 50 to 60% of what we do tonight will be interacting with you via questions and hearing the panelists kick those questions around, and maybe even asking each other questions as well, who knows. So let's start then with an introduction from the first of our four panelists, and he's a dear friend and colleague of mine from the deep Southwest. It's David Bierman. David, hello, welcome, and please give the lovely folks at home a little bit about who you are and what you do.
I'm David Bierman. I'm the strategic lead for Devon LPC. I'm an LPN chair for the Southwest. I also work for the HSN and the Clinical Research Network in developing the pharmacy offer across the Southwest region. I also had a place at the table in terms of supporting David Wright through the development of this report. So I can give some insight as to that, but clearly the voice I'm going to give you today is my own views. It doesn't come with any of those particular hats on. It's my perspective on the review and some of the perspectives I have as a result of being involved through that process.
Beautiful, David. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, so next, an absolute legend of a CEO from Lancashire LPC, and genuinely, I watch what this woman does and what her LPC does all the time, because they have been one of the most constructively disruptive LPCs, innovating stuff for donkey's years. So it's my pleasure to introduce Kath Golson. Kath, yourself, was that a big enough intro for you?
That was big enough. Thank you, Michael. And good evening, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. Yes, my name is Kath Golson. I can be found up here in Community Pharmacy Lancashire. I'm the Chief Executive Officer. We cover Blackpool, Blackburn with Darwin and Lancashire. So we've got 367 contractors out there covering 3 health and wellbeing boards. So we can really see a wide variety of how everybody does things differently within the same contract. And we've got a great split across the patch. We've got sort of 41% will be CCA, 48% independent and 11% AIM. So we've got a really strong contractor base from which to talk to patients and commissioners. So it's just great tonight to be invited along to share what we're doing up here in Lancashire.
Thank you. And next, another absolute legend of an innovator. You know, David Wright in his mechanic talks about the formation of kind of new and innovative LPCs, maybe potentially taking on a larger footprint. And my dear colleague James Wood from down in the southeast, Surrey and Sussex LPC, certainly exemplifies that as well. James, give the lovely people a little bit about yourself, please.
Hi, Michael. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm James Wood, and I'm Chief Executive of Community Pharmacy Surrey and Sussex. And as Michael said, we are a federation of 3 LPCs across East Sussex, West Sussex and Surrey, representing just over 530 pharmacy contractors in that area. So like Kath, also quite a big area across 4 local authorities, 13 CCGs, 2 STPs, a whole mix of contractors in terms of ownership. So it's great to be with you tonight and to be able to share really from my personal perspective and through my lens as a chief officer of an LPC who at some point will be responsible for implementing any agreed recommendations around this at a local level.
Super, thanks. And you know, for myself as a chief executive of an LPC down in Somerset in the southwest, I have the privilege of looking after 102 contractors in what we do. So it just shows you the scope and the range of LPCs out there. But tonight we're joined by 2 great big innovative LPC leaders. Okay, lastly, my dear board colleague Jay Badenhorst, and Jay's here tonight to sort of anchor our discussion around the emerging beliefs of the NPA and where it would like to see the Wright review going. But Jay also brings an awful lot of personal pharmacy, political and practice experience as well. Jay, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Michael. Yeah, so Jay Badenhorst, I've been a pharmacist for over 20 years now, mostly practicing in the UK, before that in South Africa. So it's not a Birmingham accent for some people. That's it wrong. Don't know why, but never mind. So yeah, I'm immensely passionate about what community pharmacy can do, and also how we can shape the healthcare and what we do in a pharmacy as a result of the Wright review, and maybe with some of the challenges that's now turning into opportunities with COVID as well. I'm also very passionate about social justice and corporate social responsibility. And really pretty much with my background, that's sort of the reason why I like that as well. So that combined with pharmacy gives me sometimes a unique perspective on things as well. So tonight I will be representing the NPA views, and also maybe bring a little bit of my own personal ideas and perspective in there as well. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Jay. Beautiful. Okay, so I guess when we were teeing this up and I was selecting my panel, I had some thoughts in mind around where we might go with this, you know, suggested themes, if you like. But please, the panelists know that I'm not going to hold them to answer these specific themes. But you know, I'm wondering what people's reactions are to the Wright review recommendations, because it's a big parcel of stuff, isn't it? So what does it potentially feel and look like for us at a macro level? Because if you add it all up together, it's a hell of a lot of change. And you know, what is the route ahead here? And actually, as we move down this route ahead, what will we get as a reward for doing it? You know, what is the realization of this review? And you know, where will we end up if we implement a version of it? That's kind of what's fascinating me. And you know, it ain't easy in community pharmacy at all, is it? It's just not for the faint-hearted at the minute. But you know, in some ways, it's one of the most challenging but also exciting times for what we're doing. So together, let's hear from the panel. Let's ask a bunch of questions, please, and observations. Simon, my colleague from the NPA, who's running the clever on this one, and I will be looking out for the questions as you pop them in. But we are going to parcel them all in to the session at the end once the 4 panelists have spoken. So if we don't answer your question at the end of a particular panelist, please don't worry. I promise you we'll do our best to pick it up and come back. Okay. Plenty enough from me then. So first panelist deliberately is David, and again I thought it would be fascinating, given David's deep experience of pharmacy and leadership, and his recent experience of being on David Wright's review group, steering group itself, to hear from David first. David, thank you. Over to you.
Okay, I'm not going to go into depth at any or all the recommendations in turn. So I just thought I'd give you a general overview to start with. I think it's fair to say that the report ended up much more radical than we initially expected it to. I think there are a number of reasons for that. Firstly, that we haven't had a review ever of the system. So I guess we have to recognise the world has changed quite substantially from when the PSNC and the LPCs were first developed. And not only that, I think if you were honest with yourself and looked at the way and the outcomes that we've had over the last few years in terms of our negotiation output from the PSNC, and potentially the diversity of provision through LPCs, we can't honestly say everything is working smoothly and effectively on behalf of contractors in the current environment. So I guess if we really reflected, we shouldn't be that surprised by the outcome being very much more weighty in terms of the number of recommendations than we initially anticipated. In terms of the observations through it, when we talked through, I think it became quite clear that particularly around negotiations and other things, others are doing better than we are in terms of outcomes that are being achieved. And that may be partly due to the way they engage the clinical people to the table and patients to the table, etc. But it's also to do with the way their whole organisations align to have one voice and driving a consistent viewpoint of what their agenda is. So that felt quite critical through the process of the review in terms of creating a mechanism for achieving that goal. Thinking about how you do that and how you set up your organisations to negotiate and how you align everything through, it was quite critical. And I think you can see it. There's a lot of threads in there that help to achieve that objective. But within it as well, I think there was a recognition that there's a need for greater efficiency and effectiveness. And especially if you're going to bring forward a stronger national team, there needs to be a way of funding that within the existing envelope. So I guess it's not without expectation that there was some level of consolidation at national level of some of the functions. Now, I have to say, I think people have read all this report as diktat, and I don't think it's kind of intended in that way. I think there's a lots of here about principles and directions of travel, but actually the detail, I think, is still to be worked through in some of the instances. And one of the reasons for setting up the council quite early in David's mind, I believe, is that actually, what actually happens, it can be driven by us. And the extent to which all those recommendations go through can be driven through the council in principle. So the extent to which we centralise and devolve is in our hands, really, and what those mechanisms and details are, I believe, are written the way it is. It suggests that we still have an ability to flex this. I think David's indicated that as well in the way he's moved slightly around, things such as tenure and things such as the provider companies. So all in all, I think there is a significant number of positive things in this report. As well as that, if you look at the individual items, when all of them, such as length of tenure and things such as that, yes, there are downsides of a lot of these things, and I personally will be affected by it, but you have to look at things such as the vibrancy, so that our refreshing will bring, in balance with the potential lack of skill set that you might involve. And so there is in a lot of these things, there is a balance between risk and gain. And I believe through most of them, in fact, the great majority of them, the balance is in the favour of making those changes. So, I think that there's a lot of good positivity in this in terms of things that we might get. There are other areas of clear concern around the geography and size of LPCs, etc. And yeah, I can understand that, but we've also got to find a way of getting the best value, which is where we need to start thinking about, to what extent do we centralise versus devolve? I think that's a critical question in some of these things. And what we mustn't do is completely denude local. We've got to make best of local and best of national. And so how we get that balance is pretty critical in this. There are, I think, some really interesting pieces around the Chair's Council. I personally think that's potentially very powerful if we can get that right, because it will make us one organisation potentially, rather than really siloed elements. There are clear, again, risks with that in terms of we really need to create a cohort of really strong, capable leaders going into that council. How do we do that? I'm not saying they're not now, but there is certainly some training and development we might require, and some review of who is really up for this. So there are clear issues around making that function well, but its potential is potentially very, very high. So it's, again, looking at the balances within that. Sorry, the other elements here are thinking through, such as the fact it isn't a diktat, but we need to think through about when do we actually continue with this process of change as well? Is it a one-off? Is it something we come back and revisit in a cycle, or is it something that we build into our current processes? So are we going to create organisations that continually evolve, or do we need to come back and do radical changes every 5 years to meet the new world? I believe you're going to need an element of review going forward, but I also think we need to think far more strongly about regularly evolving what we've already got. There's an element here as well around engagement. Engagement's going to be pretty critical in the future, because at national and at local level, that engagement will deliver our results. There's a real powerful element within the report around engaging at local level. It's potentially less noticeable at national level, and that may be something we want to have a look at. I'm slightly nervous about not having a really strong engagement capability at national team level. Because we need that really in order to drive our negotiation strategy in an effective way. That negotiation strategy really does need to encompass a really good understanding of the system level, both at national and at local. So we need to bring that through, along with that clinical capability that you can draw through out of the council, and that public patient voice. That, I believe, is far more critical to success at national negotiations than we previously given countenance of, really, within when we operate. So in terms of that, the process of getting to that point is obviously complex, but if we can get to there and get to the point where we actually all operate consistently around common themes about that strategy, and we operate as one, I think we have a really strong opportunity for the future. I do anticipate really strong difficulties in getting there, and we still are, I'm afraid to say, a series of organisations that still have significant infighting, which is potentially really not helpful in getting a good negotiation outcome. So how we run through these processes to get unanimity and a consolidation around a strategy that we can all buy into and all sing off that same hymn sheet is really important going forward. And I believe this report gives us some of the structures to enable to get there, but it does require us to pull together in a common direction around supporting the general themes within this. There are some other kind of risks in here as well, particularly around, there is a potential some pulling away from support at local LPC level, which I can understand, because you can understand why some members don't view it's appropriate to utilise the levy money in that way. What we do need, however, to do is ensure that pharmacy does deliver consistently. Without that, we will not get effective service development, both at a local and national level. So we do need to think about workforce somewhere and somehow, and we do need to think about how we deliver services both at a national and local level in a really consistent fashion. So there is some risk in there if we don't consider those elements in what we do going forward. However, I think from my perspective, and I know I'm running on in time, I think from my perspective, the balance of the report is overwhelmingly positive. Is how we choose to utilise it to get towards our new future, that integrated future based very much in integrated care working with aligned to the needs of the system, but very responsive to the requirements of the contractors. That's a really important thing, and it's how we actually all encompass and around that outcome that is critical. And I think I'll leave it there, Michael, if that's okay.
No, that's brilliant, David. Thank you for those deep and sagely thoughts. I'll not try and summarize your 10 minutes of wisdom there, but I think a key point for me is there ain't no done deal here, so to speak. There's a kind of a blueprint for a direction of travel, but there's certainly plenty to be ironed out and considered in terms of a whole package. Thank you, David. Kath, may I draw you in next, please, and ask the same of yourself. Just share your perspectives, please.
So looking at the reactions that I had and the committee had when we first read the report, well, we were welcoming the whole review. The NHS and the service that we work in, the healthcare system, has changed so much, certainly over the past few years, yet since LPCs were first thought of, that we felt it was really the right opportunity now to have a review, have a look at what we're doing well and where can we do things differently. So we've absolutely welcomed this review coming forwards. And for me, there's things in there, some are great, some things we need to work at, but you know, it's starting the conversation for all of us. And what David has been really clear about is he's taken it from the contractor. He's worked from the contractor and worked from that base upwards, and really given that emphasis and focus around those pharmacies that we have out there that you know, are pivotal to the NHS. And that was one of the big learns for me, his comment around how pivotal pharmacies are to the NHS, because without those, and certainly without those during the pandemic, we would all have been in a lot of trouble. So how can we use that, looking at pharmacies in that lens, in order to really start to talk about one voice and promote pharmacy, community pharmacy and our teams in order to build a much better future for us. So we really welcome the opportunity to start the conversation. We know that different LPCs choose to work in different ways. So how can we take the best of each of those LPCs? How can we look at that variance? And we also welcome the idea of KPIs. So we know what we're doing well, and we can help others for those that are doing well, perhaps need some support there. But very much it was a way of looking as to how LPCs are all working for the contractor, because that is where we're there to support our contractors. So one of the questions we did have though was, where's the business case in all of this? Where are we going to get our returns? If we're putting this investment in, this time, this effort, where is that business case? And I'm mindful David did this very, very quickly, but we'd really like to see some analysis now as to the return on the investment that we're going to put into this. And I think the next few months are critical for us. We'll know next week from Simon how he plans to take the review forward in the next few months before we get to the LPC conference. So for us as well, it's very important that in the next few weeks and months we all get involved in shaping those conversations, because this is our future that we're getting involved in. So it's critical in the next few months, when we're also very busy looking after patients, getting ready for flu. There's a lot to do. So how do we balance what's required in the day job with what we need to build our future? So it's getting that right, which is possibly a risk, but it's part of the reaction that we had. We also realised that it was an opportunity to perhaps burst some myths that might happen between perceptions between different groups, and that's allowed that conversation to open up so that we can all start to work honestly with working towards whatever our future is going to be. So really positive and very pleased that it starts the conversation and gives us that framework to have that conversation. What are the risks? Already talked a little bit about that around some of the time. The next few weeks and months are going to be very, very busy for us. The biggest risk is making sure that everybody gets a voice, that everyone is heard, from the individual contractor right through to the large groups. But it's what is happening on the coalface with our contractors. How can we make sure they all have a voice in shaping the future? So that is a risk if we don't get to hear those voices coming forwards. And one of the other risks that we have is around negotiations and timeframes for that. Negotiations are happening with government. It's how do we give the current team of the PSNC the support to get the best short-term negotiations, and how can we get the right negotiation team in place ready for the big negotiation so that we get the contract that is right for community pharmacy, is right for our teams, and is right for our patients and community. That is really important, and it's a risk that we haven't got a lot of time to get there. If we don't, then the consequences could be, again, a contract that might not be as robust as we would have all have hoped for. I think the other risk and opportunity with the approach that David has taken is the importance of the LPCs and the members, or as they will then be CPLs, the importance of those members and their participation, because it is from that group that the chairs are going to come forward. And the Council of Chairs is very powerful, is very influential. It reflects the voice of the contractors. For those people sitting on that council, they have a great burden of responsibility to make sure that we get everything right for community pharmacy. We know there's other models out there that we can talk to, and people can share how they have come forward with that. One of the committee actually likened perhaps the role of the chair was a bit like an MP, where you've got to be working at the top, but you've got to be absolutely sure you're talking to your constituents all the time to make sure you're picking up the voice from the ground and making sure that is heard at the top table. So the role of chair is going to be a big role. If we get that right, we've got some really powerful people in some very key places to make sure that we've got the best contract that we would be looking for. So some of those actually lead into the rewards that we were looking at. I've mentioned this before, but what's really key to me is that the pivotal role that our pharmacies have to the NHS. We're the first port of call. We have never shut our doors over the past few months, and we've shown what a robust and resilient and resourceful team of people we are. And by capturing that team and getting one voice, then we're unstoppable, formidable, if we can all work together in making sure that we get things right for our communities. It's how do we engage with our public, so we get that public voice as well, and to talk to us, rather like say the GPs, how they can get the public to talk to them. We give our public a great service. They talk about us with glowing admiration when you ask them. It's how can we convert that energy into making sure that everyone appreciates the crucial part we play of having that healthcare on your doorstep that's easily accessible for everybody. What are the other rewards? A contract fit for purpose. If we get a contract that's fit for purpose, then again, we can really shine. Our pharmacists can shine, their teams can shine, and the health of the public will increase, especially in areas of high deprivation, where our pharmacies are in the middle of that community, and would then be having the tools to help build that community and build their health. Another reward that the committee were very keen on was about how this would streamline things for us as well, streamline our voice, make us more efficient. So very keen on that streamlining that this review gives us the opportunity to look for. And then the other real reward we've got, and possibly because this is due to David's academic background, was that look at the pharmacy students coming through. Those are our lifeblood of tomorrow. And David did share some concerns around students coming through. So it's really good. It also gives us that opportunity to look at the workforce of tomorrow, and we look at them today and think of how we develop those people, because without them we cannot deliver our contract. So that was another, for me, that was another slant that this review has put onto community pharmacy. Realisation, for me, this is very much around how important we are as a workforce, what the opportunities are for our pharmacists, for our technicians, what opportunities can we give our teams so that we can really make a a very strong community pharmacy network within England. And the realisation would be with national negotiations and good negotiations, strong negotiations at a local level as well, because with this approach, with having chairs working at a council level, those skills will cascade down as well. So how stronger we could be at a local level as well in working up negotiations at that level. So I'm not quite sure, Michael, how I've done for time there, but that was just a whistle-stop tour from Lancashire.
And it's a great destination. Kath, thank you for your shares there, and thank you also for following the kind of the R theme that I kind of put out there. You really brought to life those risks, rewards, and realizations for me as I was listening there. Thanks, Kath. James, may we draw you in next, please, then?
Thanks, Michael. So from Catherine, we're now heading south, and reactions from here. So I guess, first of all, just some personal thoughts about, this is a historic review, never been done before. And it's, I thought it was a great read. And I guess one of the challenges, especially for NPA members online tonight, is just kind of getting through some of that detail. But if you haven't got there, I really encourage you to do so, because I think whether you're a bit geeky like me and want to get into some of the detail and the governance sort of stuff, there's also in there for everyone really in the sector, whether you're a contractor, an employee, a student, member of the wider pharmacy team. I think what it does do is offer hope and some of the possibilities about if we can organise ourselves in a more effective way and in a way that meets our needs in the future, what might be possible. And I think that is one of the exciting things about it. I wanted to pick up on something that David said about it really sets out the principles and direction of travel. And I'd agree with that, because I guess now we've had a chance to read it and reflect a bit, it's quite clear there's still quite a lot of questions, and it almost throws up, as well as a lot of recommendations, a lot of questions, which I think is a good thing, and it helps us start a conversation in the sector nationally and locally about those. But they are to be determined by us, by contractors. But I think it needs a new way of thinking and a new way of working. So there will clearly have to be collaboration and compromise, and I think new behaviours. David himself referred to trust, and I think that's really important if we're to move forward in a different way. There's for sure some great complexities in there, not least some of the structural, organisational, individual things, but it does start to pave a way and some principles and some direction. And I guess perhaps a bit of an analogy here is, I guess it's a bit like we're a bit like buying a house, and we're kind of at the stage of, yes, we might be able to start to coalesce around the issues and some of the recommendations, but we almost need a survey on the house to check it's actually kind of exactly as in terms of understanding the risks and understanding the way forward, some of the things that Kath's already alluded to, and David, about costs and so on. So I think it's from the LPCs here in Surrey and Sussex, we read our submission that we made to the review, and we weren't a million miles away from some of the things that especially it recommended around the local and LPCs, especially being on a journey of the last 18 months to 2 years in terms of our own federation. So I think we were agreed that it shines a light on the issues broadly, so it diagnoses the right kind of problems. Maybe uncomfortable reading for some, but I think what's very clear from where I'm sat is that the contractor body has spoken, and there's evidence of that through David's different methodologies, the surveys, the interviews, and all that evidence base. And I think there's clearly some very strong signals in there about what contractors have broadly said. From a local level, I think what's encouraging to see, and certainly this was reflected by members in Surrey and Sussex, is LPCs are really, if as David describes, LPCs would be thrust into the heart of things, and especially that chair role, clearly a very different role from the chair role at the moment, but clearly that distribution of power and leadership across the network would make things much more flatter in terms of a closer relationship with contractors, right from the national level to local. And I think, especially for independents, that could be a really good thing. Some of the things in there, in terms of recommendations, I think very straightforward when you think about some of the rebranding things, some of the central support for LPCs that perhaps we've been calling for some while, but there's also some very complex and thorny things in there, like LPC mergers potentially, like some of the other governance things. But I think one of the things that will help us, and that I'm sure many are in agreement about, is a strategy for the sector, owned by the sector, to identify those common purpose and a common sense of direction. So those are some thoughts about the kind of my initial reactions and recommendations. Michael asked us to have a think about risks and way ahead and some thoughts here. And I think one of the biggest risks is clearly to discount and delay in some ways and do nothing. Clearly, you know, having shined a light on the issues, we really need to do something about it. And the clock is already ticking, given that David really put an emphasis on those future negotiations when we get not even to the end of this 5-year contractual framework deal, because those negotiations will have to start before that. So I think there's a real challenge in terms of getting things moving, discussion, gaining agreement, and all that sort of thing. And that's a big program of work. And I guess one of the biggest challenges we've all got, and the review touched on it, was capacity, both at PSNC and in other organisations, when pharmacies are incredibly busy and stretched, and so are those who represent them. So keeping this on track and doing the day job is clearly going to be a challenge. And I think this is an ongoing program of change, not just now, but you know, the review has talked about further reviews in future. I'd hope we can get to a state where we are continuously evolving and learning and being more agile and adapting to the commissioning landscape and the world around us. I think there's two practical things that are worth pointing out in terms of the risk. One is, I think, the support, and colleagues have already referred to that, and I think that's particularly important to independents. So I led an independent pharmacy for many years, for 10 years, and was an NPA board member, so know some of those challenges quite acutely myself. And I think, you know, I can understand where the report's coming from the support. I think what we need to be very careful about as a sector is to try and perhaps come up with a definition around support that we can agree around. And it's very broad, and there's clearly things that flow into representation that are appropriate for everyone, but I think we need to be talking about the same thing. And that's perhaps important, especially for independents, and to understand actually in future that support may come from elsewhere. So it will still be there, but it might be for NPA and others to make sure that some of those things are picked up. So moving on to where this all might go, and the kind of realizing some of the benefits and some of the potential. Well, I think it's really clear that you know, contractors have spoken and said, you know, they want better outcomes, stronger voice, felt like they're being listened to. And I think already we've seen, and David touched on it, the power of the PSNC, or whatever it might be in future, and the local elements working together. So during COVID, and there's been a real concerted effort and there, but also more recently we've seen just a really small example of the national contractor audit and actually the power of PSNC and LPCs, that kind of local network and leveraging that is really, really powerful. And I think some of where the report describes and the review describes where we'd like to get to is a really good sense of hope, and really leveraging the power of all the networks that we have, and thinking about, you know, working together and the spirit of reciprocity and exchange. So those are my, I think, initial thoughts and drawings on some thoughts from the committee and others here. Thank you, Michael.
James, thank you. And an awful lot of humanity in what you shared there, James, and words like hope and trust and truth and behaviors as well. And I think these things are going to be absolutely critical as we go forward. Okay. Jay, I'm gonna draw yourself in there, and you know, please share that kind of, you know, position that we're weaving within the NPA as this thing reveals itself, and you know, add stuff from your own experience within LPC and business as well, dear man. Over to you.
Thank you, Michael. First of all, I just wanted to say that it's really good to hear that David, Kath and James has pretty much done it all for me, really. So I'm about 30 seconds and just say what they said. Not just kidding. So David has really captured me by saying something like it sets the direction of travel. And I think it's very clear that this is presenting us an opportunity to set the direction of travel. And I don't think there's a better opportunity than now. I think if you think of where we are at the moment with COVID, and then having to delay the review of the publication of it, and then have almost like a revised version published because of it, I think identifies that the rewards for us can be really big if we get this direction of travel right. If we don't get it right, then of course the risks are huge. I think Kath, what echoes with me, was saying that everybody gets a voice in shaping the future. And I think that's really important. And when I start talking about the NPA's view, I'll go on a little bit more about that. And it is really, really true that everyone in this process must have a voice. From the person that is in a small pharmacy by himself, day in and day out, to the very large multiples that we have operating in the country as well. James, I liked your analogy of buying a house, having just bought a house. It's bloody awful, I can tell you that. But, you know, perseverance, you get there. And I think the strategy you were talking about for the sector, by the sector, is really important to realize as well. If we are not involved in this, then some things will be changed around us, and we will just not be in control of our destiny. So the NPA recognized the Wright Review as a genuine and a sincere attempt to create this a more coherent and an end-to-end system of representation and support, which was supposed to connect the local and national leadership, not necessarily through all of the different bodies that are in there, but pharmacy as a sector, the national leadership was really important to make those connections there. And also recognizing that the opportunity to get the great minds of community pharmacy to think collectively of how we interact with each other and with the NHS, and also with the department, but also with other stakeholders for the greater good of community pharmacy, and not necessarily for individuals within the sector, but for the greater good of the sector itself. And ultimately patients, and I worry that we sometimes forget that patients are still in the middle of this all, and we need to shape whatever happens within the sector around the patient needs, which we know on a daily basis is changing now. So regardless how they choose to access the services, we need to ensure that the Wright Review paves the way for the sector to shape themselves up in such a way to meet the needs, not just of the NHS, but for the patients, because without patients, the NHS won't exist. So at the outset of the process, the NPA set up a number of principles that we were hoping for and that we aspired to. And one of it was having a future structure of representation and support, and also the continued investment in local leadership. We realized that with local leadership and also within that implies more accountability as well, and improved accountability, which if you're not accountable for your own actions, I think you're on a very, very dangerous path, especially if you're not accountable to others as well, because a lot of times you find yourself working in isolation, forgetting about what's happening around you. And actually, we've got to remember that the sector needs to operate as a whole, not just as individual parts, but as a whole. We need to be able to operate. So we emphasize the importance of of governance in there, and it needs to be equitable for everyone. And it was really crucial to us to ensure that independents and multiples, I'm not going to exclude them, are fairly represented on a local and also national level. And what makes it a little bit more difficult is the fact that independents are also in various different sizes, from the single person to the very large organization, which still operates as an independent. And then, of course, you've got the other CCA companies involved in there as well. So whatever the structure is that emerged as a result of the review, it absolutely needs to allow the distinctive voice of the independents to be heard. And that needs to be for everyone, for all of the independents, big and small. Now, this does not come easy, I realize that. And it does require us to be really involved and actively involved. So us as the NPA need to be actively involved in participating in the process of change, and not just stand on the side and look at it happening in front of us and we hope for the best, and then we say, oh, well, if only we did more. But saying that, we also need to be aware of the unintended consequences. And that's really difficult for us to grasp at this moment in time, because there's not a lot of analysis that's been done already. And we don't know how some of the changes may affect us in the future, especially considering how the landscape of pharmacy and of healthcare provision in general is changing so rapidly around us. And for the first time ever, I think patients are actually demanding more on different levels of interaction, online transaction, face-to-face over video links. If we don't keep abreast of this and remember that that needs to form part of whatever the Wright review ends up with, we need to ensure that we are mindful of all of those changes in patient behaviors and how they want to access us. So the system at local level absolutely must be skillful in representation, and we need to be efficient and responsive to change. Now, skillful in representation, it requires someone pretty good in order to be skillful and very good at effective representation. We can do lots of representation, but a lot of it may not be very effective. But also, we need to be really, really mindful that with any changing process, there will be unrest, and there will be people that don't feel it's for them. And it's important that we take everyone that wants to be on the journey with us on the journey. And some people will be further ahead. Some LPCs will be further ahead than others. And we need to be mindful that we need to support those who's willing to come with us on the journey, but may not be quite there yet and may not quite be ready. And the NPA is really actively looking at how we can do that, and how we can support people, and how we can help some of the LPCs that may be a little bit further behind, or may perceive that they are a little bit further behind. Because a lot of the times, if I look at LPCs in different areas, they actually are very critical of themselves. And actually, if you compare them to some other LPCs, you tend to see that many are actually further ahead of what they think they are. So we need to be streamlining the network of LPCs. The NPA realizes that, and we are generally supportive of that. But we would say that it needs to reflect some of the NHS structures that's currently in place. Now, without, there's a huge risk, because we know that the NHS structure will probably change when there's a change in wind direction, because that seems to be the thing. It's a political playing field, and unfortunately the structures are continuously changing. So whatever we align ourselves to today, in 2 or 3 years change will be different. And I think it's important what James also brought in, saying that this review, I think Kath and David might have mentioned it as well, this review must not be the last one, and we must be constantly evolving in order to keep up with that. But of course, we also need to do more analysis on the year and the now, and what's being presented to us in the reviews. And it needs to be cost releasing, and whatever money is being released from the system, we would support being reinvested in local support and representation models. So we need to allow platforms for independents, specifically for our members, to think collectively about how we respond. And I'm saying collectively because if we don't respond collectively and it is lots of little voices all coming with their own ideas, it will be very difficult to get a coherent approach to the sector, and especially for the NPA members and the independent sector. So we need to think of how we can collectively respond to this review. And we also realize that there's still a lot of other things to consider as well before the NPA can endorse the recommendations as they stand. So I'm going to say this, we are still asking questions and we are still connecting with the independent reps of the LPCs through various different media forms. You've seen on social media, there's NPA television on YouTube, loads of things happening at the moment. But absolutely crucial, we are keeping our finger on the pulse of our members. And that's going to go through a series of mini surveys in the coming weeks where we ask snap surveys. What do you think of this? Can you tell us about that? What's your thoughts on this? And that will help the NPA shape their views in order for us to make a collective response for all of our members and potentially for the other independent contractors in the country as well, to help shape what as a result of the Wright review. So one of the key questions that we've had is whether contractors can be confident that they are going to get better value for money, better value for money. It lures in the word better value for money in the future. As a total sum of the levies which they invest locally and nationally as well. The whole way of how levies are being collected and all of that, I think there's still a lot to be decided, and the unintended consequences of having a national levy, I think it needs to be explored and see what the differences can be, because how do you distribute from a national back to a local level if it's already in a national pot? It's very important that we understand the implications with that and also the risks associated with that. So I don't think it's unreasonable for some of the contractors to ask whether they're going to spend more or less the same. And if we can't answer those questions at the moment, I think we do need to do more information analysis on it in order for us to answer those questions. But I don't want us to forget about the current situation, and we are conscious of the pressing, the here and the now, the pharmacies on the front line, and having to change on a constant basis in order to respond to our patients, and also to government advice that seems to be changing on a fairly regular basis as well. So it's really important that we also focus on what we are doing now, whilst we are looking into the future and staring into that crystal ball and hoping that we can see what it looks like. But it's absolutely crucial that we can't be spending years looking inwards, trying to figure it out what it needs to look like for the sector, whilst the world is moving on around us. And let's not forget that the world I'm referring to is not just patients and pharmacy. It's also about commissioners, our fellow healthcare workers, other healthcare workers, and the third-party stakeholders, the charities that we work with. All of those people will be moving on. So if we don't come to a coherent response to the Wright review fairly quickly and fairly urgently, and then start acting on that, there is a real risk that the world will move on. And when we finally put our head above the parapet, then it will be a changing feast again for us. So the NPA, we're still actively engaging in the review process. And it is a unique opportunity for us to change what we are doing for the many and not just for the few. The NPA specifically representing independent community pharmacy, we are working really hard to have a collective response in order for us to help deploy the resources better, to help shape the changes that will be coming better. And I do think that if we do get it right, it will be well worth the effort for that we have put in, not just as the NPA, but as the whole sector, that maybe as a result of the Wright review. I'm going to leave it at that, Michael. Is that all right for now?
Jay, thank you for sharing that set of thoughts. So let's just take a wee moment now. We've heard from our four panelists. We've got an expanding audience of people actually joining us as we're moving through, which is great. We've had a flurry of questions. Please, audience out there, get those questions up there. There's got to be stuff that this thoughtful panel are triggering in your mind. So get typing, get on that Q&A function and get some in. But I'm gonna kick off with a handful of the questions that we've had first. Please I'm struggling tonight to get these in the right order because literally they're just coming up and they're really good questions. So first question is, well, okay, so how can people get involved? Now, we had the Wright review and David and his team reached out and there were surveys, there were contractor listening events, etc. But what can people do now to get involved? What would you guide them on? And if we run through the panel in the order we heard from initially, just to see if there's anything there. So David, I wonder, from your Devon LPC experience and more broadly, what would you say to people out there in terms of them getting involved for this next stage?
The LPCs have been asked to feed into the PSNC about what they think the structure and setup of the group should be that take this group forward. And I would suggest people should feed into their LPCs around that, about how they feel, what kind of organisational structures are needed, what your view about the change process should be, and about pace and about level of involvement. I would suggest you connect with your LPCs and make your views plain, so that can be built into the thought process about how we structure that change process. Because I would agree with Jay that actually, and with James, that what the key issue here is that we've got to move forward with this. It's not something we can sit on, because I believe the perception of us would be detrimentally impacted substantially if we didn't get on and do something. So it's a question of the how, the pace, and clearly about the resources that we need to put into it. And it would be really useful, I think, to have contractors making their views known to LPCs about how you think it should be handled.
Beautiful, David. So that I mean, that wasn't prime, David, but I thought that would be your answer because it's a logical answer. Can I flip that one over then and kind of say to Kath, so if we're asking contractors to reach out to us as a bunch of LPCs, I wonder what the LPCs might think about doing next in terms of their engagement back out to their contractors. I've heard lots of different ideas at the minute about people gearing up to do listening events or maybe even kind of focus groups or whatever, but in Somerset, I'm not sure we've clearly worked out what we think we need to do next. Have you had any thoughts knocking around Lancs?
Yeah, so some of the thoughts, it's around how do we use social media now that we're all well into Zoom and Microsoft Teams. I think next week will be pivotal for us when we actually hear the approach that Simon Dukes wants to take, because that then gives us something to hang our hat on. Once we have that structure, then we can understand either how we work around that to reach out to contractors. Is it snap surveys? Is it Zoom? Is it maybe just hitting the phones and talking to people and asking them if we can see which of our contractors are sharing their thoughts? If there's some that aren't, then there's nothing to stop us ringing them up and asking. I just think it's going to be very intense in these next few weeks to make sure we hear everybody's voice, whether that is volunteered from them or we reach out to them, but perhaps using different forms, maybe Twitter as well. Many people use Twitter. So what are the different social media routes we can use to get people's ideas back and feed them back to PSNC? So those were my first thoughts, Michael.
Yeah, really good. And I've been kicking around NPC badge hat as well. James, any different from Surrey and Sussex, mate?
Yeah, so I guess first of all is to say that don't forget your LPC and PSNC representatives who they currently are. And last week LPC representatives and PSNC met collectively. I think there was 180 representatives there in a virtual meeting. They're all contractors or representatives or contractors too, representing you. So speak to them individually is also a really important way of an important channel in. And I'm sure there'll be a lot more opportunities for that. In terms of us in Surrey and Sussex, similar things to Kath. I think we're thinking about some listening exercises, maybe around our AGMs in September, especially that this year we're going to be doing things like everybody else virtually, but also perhaps some more informal, picking up the phone, especially to smaller contractors. We need to think about how we'll do that to the larger operators, and think about making sure that we also bring everybody's voice in. This is kind of big tent stuff, but you know, some of that, and just kind of understanding a bit more of the detail. Michael, one of the questions I've had raised this week actually by a independent contractor was, and I thought it was a good one. They kind of said, well, we've already told you, you know, we responded collectively, we've all responded to the Wright review. Why are you asking me? I think, you know, and I can, you know, if you're sat out there kind of thinking that, I think that's a really important point, in that, you know, contractors have spoken. We need to keep remembering that in terms of our discussions moving forward for LPC members and PSNC members when they're in the context of that. But also, I think it's about some of the things David said about thinking about, well, okay, now that David has reported that in his review, what about, what do people feel about the priorities? What are maybe the concerns? Those kind of things in terms of that next stage.
Yeah, that makes really good sense. I mean, I was nearly tempted to use the phrase "get Brexit done" there, James, but I sort of shied away from it, really. Jay, just to extend this bit about, you know, the LPC and what it can do. You in your gambit there we're talking about what the NPA could do. I know what you were talking about, because it's myself that's trying to make those things a reality. So we've done a series of vidcasts. We've reached out from the perspective of contractors thinking about the Wright review. We've invited in some great guests from the world of LPC leadership to talk about their perspective on it. We're going to be doing these mini surveys, these instant vox pops. We're obviously doing tonight. Our dear chair, Andrew Lane and Mark Lyonette, did a kind of a vidcast on a NPA position only last week. So we're being quite active really in this space, and one might argue we're being more active than some of the other leadership bodies at the minute in terms of trying to move our thinking down the path here. Jay, I mean, what are you hearing out there from contractors and indeed from the businesses that you're involved with? You know, what do you think those businesses want next?
I'll tell you what I hear, which is really worrying. I'm hearing very little, Michael. And that there's a lot of contractors that don't even know what the Wright review is yet. And I think there's a lot of them that don't actually think that it will affect them. To give an example, I recently went to an LPC event, and it was an event specifically for the Wright review, and there was a grand spanking 0 contractors that turned up.
Wow.
And that is extremely worrying, really worrying. The fact that there's still contractors out there that probably don't know what a pivotal moment in their lives this is. Maybe people that is maybe on the way out of the sector due to retirement or whatever, but actually their opinions are just as valuable, if not more valuable, because of the experience they've got already in order to help shape the people that is coming into the sector. And I think, you know, I know the question, I'm not sort of answering the question, but for me, how do we reach out to people? If you ask the 5 of us just on the panel here, how do you learn? We all learn in a different way. You know, I learn by listening and, you know, following instructions. Other people learn by reading and repeating things. And it's the same with communication. We can't just be saying we've got to follow social media, or let's do a snap survey, or let's write to everyone, or let's do a Zoom. We need to take all of those methods and we need to communicate all of the time with those methods in order to get as many as possible views from the contractors. And I really think that people should not be scared to come to the NPA, even if they're not an NPA member. No, because we need to have a view. And of course, if you're an NPA member, we're going to reach out to you. But if you haven't got anyone else that you feel you can turn to, or you don't know who your LPC is, or you don't feel you can talk to them, or whatever, then there needs to be someone that they can go to. And like what James was saying, there are PSNC reps around. You know, use those people, use the other representation bodies that there's AIM, there's CCA. We've got to make sure that we've got our finger on the pulse with everything and ears on the ground everywhere at this moment in time. And I think the leaders in this sector has got a duty to ensure that everyone gets the opportunity to talk and be listened to at the same time.
Fantastic. I mean, I'm also watching the participants and watching the questions coming in, and there's some lovely observations. I'm going to make a personal address to some people who are in this audience tonight, and they know who they are. You guys are connected. You guys are very engaging and engaged in the organs and the various publications that you kind of use. I think more education and engagement from certain people watching tonight would be greatly appreciated, and I know the NPA would be very happy to reach out to Richard, Rob, Neil, whoever, and actually work with you to really light a fire under this. So that's just a direct personal appeal. You know where we are. Let's connect and do something. Okay. Some real nitty-gritty questions in now, and I think these are really important. So I'm personally confused over this one. You know, when I think about representation and support, I do see it as a bit of a continuum, a bit of a spectrum. And when David says we're not in the business of support anymore, I'm struggling to know which bit of the spectrum that I actually need to cut out. So what does good support look like going forward here? What do you think LPCs should still be doing? What do you think LPCs or CPLs and the PSNC should still be doing to help all contractors, please? Any thoughts on that?
Michael, I think it really depends on whether we are looking at the world as it is now, or whether it is in order to get contractors from where we are now into the world where we are going to be, or whether we are shaping and setting up the support in the world which we are going to end up in. And I think right now, the support that the LPCs need to do is in order to almost future-proof the contractors that's in the areas at the moment, in the LPC areas, in order to help them from where we are now, in order to get to where we want to be. And that support will be to explain, you know, if this happens, if you have to vote for this option, and there may be some votes happening at some point, who knows, if you had to vote for this option, if you vote A or B, those may be the consequences. If you don't vote, those may be the consequences. And I think we really need to do some thorough analysis in what the implications are of some of those recommendations in the review, and actually stipulate and just spell it out to people. If you vote for a national levy, you are not going to get it, you know, being collected on the LPC level, etc., etc. If you vote for this, then it's not going to be that. And that sort of support, that nitty-gritty, that nuts and bolts, I think it will help people understand the implications of the review better as well. Because, you know, not everyone are big thinkers. And I'm not saying that's wrong either. You know, some people very happy to go to the day in and day out and do the job and look after those patients absolutely 100%. And we should not forget that those people may not have, you know, the time even to read over 100-page review. They may only have time to read the executive summary and don't really understand all of the finer detail in there. So again, it is our duty as the NPA, but also as LPCs, to support the people to understand what is in there without actually having to rely on them to read 120 pages.
Thank you. If I could turn to my LPC colleagues, so Jay was making the strong point there. Let's handhold. Let's support people through this stage of the review. More broadly, though, I mean, based on what David has said, what do you think you will be stopping doing for contractors, James or Kath? Is there stuff that you think that's off limits now? I'm not going to be able to do it.
Shall I go? Do you want me to make a start? I think, you know, I've already said that that support, you know, support is a very broad term, and I think one of the things we kind of need to do as a next stage as a sector would be useful to do is to try and understand a definition around support in this context, and I think, and then to start to think about what we can all, what different parts of the sector can agree on really in terms of that. But there was clearly some things described in there by David. Certainly I don't recognise the vast majority of the LPCs doing these, but there was clearly some evidence there that some LPCs were perhaps providing support that maybe favoured one part of the sector over another, and I can see where there might be issues with that. I think another area was around some of the training aspects, and that some of those things might be best dealt with centrally. So there's clearly some things there that might look different in future. I think certainly the local element, so the L in LPC, I think will still be important. And I think it's trying to rationalise actually what support can and only be provided locally, and then by who. So is that the role of the LPCs will be important to understand, and perhaps what support is already provided nationally and doesn't need to be duplicated. So I think there's also scope around that. But I think just kind of really getting under the skin of what support looks like to make sure that we don't accidentally throw some things out that are really, really important in terms of all the general body of contractors. And I think where that's important and could affect representation and our future role, then clearly I think that's really important that support continues.
Thanks, James. I really agree, and that was helpful for me personally too. Thank you. Kath, anything you would build on, James?
Yeah, very much around the local. And if I give you an example, this morning, for example, with the local, at Blackburn with Darwin, before 9 o'clock, we were having calls from contractors. What do we need to do? Because you'll all have seen how the Director of Public Health has put 5 steps in place. With the contacts that I and my team have, we were able to ring straight into public health. What's the situation? And we had, by just gone 10 o'clock this morning, all our contractors had posters in their inboxes advising patients to be wearing face coverings when they enter into that pharmacy. And I would suggest there was no other part of the system that could have reacted that quickly to get people who are busy opening doors, switching off alarms, briefing teams, and trying to get the head around what is going on, and also understand what's happening in the environment around the pandemic. So for us, that was a prime example of who else in the system is able to react that quickly to support every contractor on the ground, to get them the help they need so they can carry on running their business and keep the team safe. So that's just an example of today. For ourselves, it's where does representation and support split? You can be supporting when you're representing, you can be representing and supporting. So there are clearly some examples of where it can be done nationally, or where some of that support is perhaps stitched into a new service and that training is put in there. But I think it's very much that capital L of knowing the people on the ground, and movers and shakers, and when you really need to get to them quickly, you know exactly who to go to get the answers that you need.
Yeah, spot on, Kath. Thank you.
Mike,
yeah, Dave.
I think the old adage, follow the money, comes in to some extent. And yeah, I think it is vital to reinforce the national negotiating group and the central team. So I have absolutely no difficulty with that. What we don't understand at this point in time, given we're now in a post-COVID world, I think before COVID we would have said our contract's fixed for 5 years, definitely, etc. We don't know how the change in requirements are now coming thick and fast will move thought processes on around that, and so we do need to be cognizant of things may happen that require national team support around that. But there is also PCNs, the development of the local and the local funding streams coming into primary care. And we mustn't lose sight that there may be a significant opportunity there for pharmacy in integrated working with those as well. So I think there is a real opportunity here to think about what is the relative opportunity in the two areas, and making sure that we embrace and grasp as much of those opportunities as we can, wherever direction they come from. And I think the other point I'd like to make is that the Wright review really focuses on levy funding. And it isn't saying that you shouldn't be innovative. It isn't saying you shouldn't go out there and grasp HE local funding to support training and development and things such as that. So I think David would be deep mortified if he felt that what he was suggesting in any way dampened down the innovative potential of local teams. What he'd like to see is make sure that's more coordinated and considered and aligned, so we don't duplicate effort. But you know, it is very much about local teams still having a high degree of autonomy to drive their own destiny, but based not only on the levy funding, which we've been to stipulate what that's for, but also the potential of seeking other access to other funding elements to do something a more broad spectrum, if that's what the local contractors wish to do.
Beautifully put, David. A couple of comments to share from the audience then, just on our dialogue here. A colleague, I think, commenting basically on yourself, James and Kath. LPC leaders in this have got it right. LPCs should not defer to PSNC on the right answer about local versus national, etc. So PSNC's approach, this commenter writes, local isn't important. I'm going to build on that. I was really disappointed by the Wright review and the fact that although if you word searched it, PCNs were mentioned 28 times, not once in any of the structure did David really give a compelling vision for a construct of LPCs that I felt shone through. We went to the big circuit diagram of what the national body looked like, and I've heard a lot of people say that the obsession of the review has been what we need to do nationally, and local as a priority has been perhaps de-emphasized. Have the panel heard similar things, and do you have any views on whether or not this is about national and depletion of local?
Michael, do you want to review?
Yes, Jay, far ahead.
So we are broadly supportive of streamlining the network of the LPCs in order to reflect an NHS structure. The NHS structure, I think, is still yet to be decided, because if you look at the level of the PCN, that's quite small. But if you look at larger organisation structures like ICS levels, that is very, very big. And I think it's still a little bit unsure about how will it operate if it's on a PCN level or on a larger level. But what we're absolutely clear on is that we've got to invest in local leadership development, and that includes PCN pharmacy leads. Whatever the role of the PCN will be in the future, that PCN lead pharmacist and the pharmacy needs to be, they need to invest in that. And we also need to allow backfill funds to attend meetings and collaborative working events, because if the PCNs are not mobilized in the right way in order to achieve that, it is not going to achieve anything. On my local LPC, where I'm in Teesside chairman of, the LMC has got a very, very strong view, which I'm not going to say right now what it is, about PCNs, which I will say it isn't always very favorable of PCNs. Now, I worry that if there are already voices that are sort of diminishing the role of PCNs, then are we already on the way out with PCNs before it's even been set up and try to achieve anything with that? I think the problem is that there has been very, very little investment, apart from some other places, very few other places where there has been investment. And it's been shown that if there has been investment, it works very well. And again, it just shows you that inequality between LPC levels, where there's maybe 4 or 5 or 6 different PCNs where there's very little happening, and then they question the use of it, into different areas. I think, Michael, you're in one that's actually doing very well, and there has been investment in PCNs, and funny enough, it's doing great things.
Yeah, true.
Michael, could I come in there? Just
please, James.
Some thoughts there about the local and the observation that's been made. So I think it's really, really important, the L in LPC, as I've said before. The NHS, whilst a national health service, everything is kind of delivered and implemented locally, even some national things. So even within the contractual framework, the pharmacy contract is managed from a contract management perspective at a local or regional level. A lot of the things are implemented locally when we think about some of the things through the integration fund over the last 18 months to 2 years, locally implemented, working with LPCs and so on. Through COVID, we think about testing, antibody testing, other things, all that is kind of local. So it's really, really, clearly really important that, there's a strong local network. I think my interpretation of the Wright review is that, the LPCs are going to be thrust to the heart of things in terms of decision making, And I think that that's flowing through some of the importance there of having strong local representative structures to work with, the NHS that does things locally, but actually having, some of the representatives directly, so the chairs much more closer to that national and local split, is really important to get that kind of leadership across the network, across all contractors, and things to feel much closer, stronger and more trusted relationships, I think, and the perception of that is important. But, I think the local thing, I think, is really important for all those things, innovation and other things, and we just need to make sure that is not lost, it's amplified, and actually having a coordinated network of LPCs is a really powerful thing.
That's a really interesting way of looking at it, and I will ruminate on that, James, myself. So by having local embedded in the national through the new council, we may find in time that the dynamic changes, so we get the best for national and the best for local. That's really interesting. Kath, you're nodding there. What to add, please?
No, I think that's a very good insight into this. And in the report, the structure is very much around what community pharmacy England would look like. But all of this is built on that cornerstone of the LPCs, the local contractors electing LPCs, which David Wright is talking about the LPCs being smaller, so that's where he's getting some of the saving of the money and some of the efficiencies. But I don't think we should underestimate the ask of those LPC members. The ask has just gone up a huge amount, and from that base, that is where our chairs are coming from. Yeah. So it's really important that, and we could be lost by the fact we have got an organogram that is very much about community pharmacy England, and the CPL is at the bottom with a little bit going off for the CEO, chief officers group, that actually that is the foundation of the whole thing. So we really do need to be looking very carefully at how we build our LPCs, the people that sit on there, and they then become the lifeblood of the chairs, who will then be working at national level and local level and building that link. They develop to be at a national level that will just cascade back down, so that we have much more strength and expertise at a local level by virtue of the fact they're also working at national. So it goes both ways.
Yeah, I think that two-way thing is something that's going to give me a bit more hope, I must admit. So a couple of observations, and James hit upon this in his opening panel speech about, we need to develop that sense of trust with each other, and Kath, you talked about one voice, etc. But the truth is, has David Wright copied the BMA structure here, thinking that, that's great, it works for them, it'll work for us? I don't think there's an awful lot of multinational corporate general practice wrapped up in the world of BMA. I think it's pretty much more or less an homogenous set of independent contractors. So if we're going down to a model that's BMA-like, we're not living in that reality. How do we guard against the idea that this will now be about jockeying for power and control of CPLs and then CPL chairs and then feeding back up? Help me feel positive that things won't happen like that. There won't be political jockeying. At present, the CCA have not overly invested in LPC chairs. They have 15 out of the total 69, I understand, which is approximately 20%, but they've got 40% of the contractors. So if we go to 50 LPCs, and if people begin to jockey for control of chairs because they think that's the reins of power, how can we steer away from that ending up happening, do you think, panel?
For me, it's about focusing on the abilities of the individual to carry out roles. One of the things I've had some angst about through this is this issue of proportionality, etc. That's driven out of lack of trust, proportionality, to a high extent. And probably in the short term it is necessary. But I think we do need to emphasise behaviour change, to the fact that we need to collaborate for the benefit of all, to get that unified voice and clarity of purpose, because only by doing that do we get the best main contract outcome. And I think we need to focus on that as our prime objective through this change process. It's about getting that unified approach. And I can get what James and Kath were saying about, the fact that you've got the LPCs at the core of the decision making, now the national body, should hopefully create one body. So we shouldn't think of ourselves as CPE and the CPCs. We should think of ourselves as one body, as one organisation, but sub-elements, one supporting the other, really. And in that context, we need to make sure we have the right people in the right place to do things, and have that philosophy about our process. I think we probably won't get there overnight immediately. I think we'll probably have to go through a birthing pains around some of this. But I think if we can have a real focus on our key purpose, which is about getting the best outcomes at national level, then I think hopefully people should coalesce around that effective selection process of chairs through the committee, as opposed to come from their own organisational bents.
Thanks, David. Really sensible thoughts. And anybody else wish to chip in on this point about how we get the behaviours right, and it isn't about power, it's about doing the right thing for the sector?
Michael, I can understand that there might be quite a lot of angst and concern about this area, and clearly we need to have more. There needs to be more discussion and honest and open discussion about all of that moving forward. I think, building on some of the things that David said, it does, I think it comes back to that behaviours piece, and also that, LPCs are proportional for the contractors they represent. And I think it's about how we make, how LPC members, how committee members, all can be supported and developed to have a fair chance at putting themselves forward to the chair role. So to make sure that is, we're drawing from a really diverse group, and clearly we need to think about development for those future roles in the widest sense.
Thanks, James. Any other final thoughts as we run down the clock and close?
Michael, just the NPA is acutely aware of what you've just highlighted, and we are calling for really clear governance to be in place before we get to that selection process, to ensure that all contractors are evenly represented, independents and multiples. And we should also remember that saying when as if it's almost been voted on already, but let's say for argument's sake the LPCs do merge and become bigger, and at different geographies and different scale, and 200 contractors, etc. They will be proportioned differently already as well. So just by mere fact that the landscape will look different could potentially mean that there are different people running for the chair positions, which will mean that there will be a different proportion and potentially maybe an equal split between CCA independents and let's forget AIM is also in the mix, although they are also independents, but they're larger independents. So we just need to ensure that governance is in place so that this land grab doesn't happen, regardless of which part of the sector you are representing.
Okay, thank you. I'm really conscious of time, folks. I want to wrap us up and close this down. And of course, the first thing I want to say is, actually, I really enjoyed that, and I personally listened and learned a lot from that myself. Thank you to the points that you've raised, panel. Thank you to our audience for actually stimulating the discussion and adding their commentary. I just want to specifically name check a colleague who's been very actively typing, and I know you're not able to see this, but Paresh Modizi, I want to reach out to you afterwards on the philosophical points that you've been making, because they've been really super. I want to thank the panel. I want to thank everybody for turning up. I actually wanted to say, on behalf of the NPA, thanks for your attention and the time you've invested tonight. This is being recorded, and we are going to release the link of this so that other people can get benefit from it. The last thing then is look out for our session tomorrow night, when we are going to explore local structures and the role of community pharmacy working more closely with general practice in the construct of PCNs to see, are these things real and can we make a difference there? The details for that session will be on our website itself. So again, look, many thanks. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and please do reach out to myself and the NPA if you so desire, and we will follow up. A thank you to the range of colleagues that joined us for tonight, and again to our panel. Good night.
Good night.